and welcome to Alberta Live, brought to you by Fuse Logic TV. I'm Sunita Zucchi. Today we are going to talk about the economic and political implications of the federal elections and the impact, if any, on the upcoming provincial elections in Alberta, Ontario, Quebec. With me in the studio is Lorne Gunter, a senior columnist at the Edmonton Journal. He's also part of the editorial board at National Post. And joining us from Quebec is Gilbert Gagné. Dr. Gilbert Gagné teaches at political science at the university, Bishop's University. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Welcome.
I guess we'll begin with the political implications of the federal elections. What is your what's your take on what's happened?
No, I think the first thing that Canadians will notice is that there's not as much tension in Ottawa all the time because the House of Commons isn't constantly on edge, worried about falling and triggering another election. So we'll get back to sort of more steady kind of government where the opposition, of course, is still angry most of the time at what the government is doing, but not everyone is worried about each word that they utter because they're afraid it'll trigger another general election. So we'll get back to the way things were. Probably the best parallel is between about 1997 and 2000 when the Liberals had a small majority, but enough of a majority that they were able to keep things on a fairly steady keel.
However, there are a lot of economic implications. Of course, there are political implications as well because we have a more left of center party. I don't know whether it's a centrist party, but it's definitely it's ideologically more tuned to the left. And we also have this whole phenomenon of Quebec. Mm-hmm. What are the implications as far as the economy is concerned, at least as far as Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta go?
Well, I think you'll see no more stimulus than we've seen already. So you're not going to see the government investing a great deal more money in the economy. If it's going to try and make some changes in the economy, it'll probably do it through changes in regulations, making it easier for companies to start up, or it'll do it through tax stimulus, by cutting taxes rather than by actually taxing everyone and giving money to businesses to try and keep jobs flowing and the economy going. So you'll see that, but I don't think you're going to see an enormous economic difference between the last couple of years and the next 4 years. It's still going to be a fairly steady, small. When you say small C conservative, people tend to think you mean right wing. When I say conservative economically, in this case, I mean they're not going to take a lot of risks. They're not going to drastically cut taxes, drastically lower regulations, drastically spend more. They're just going to keep it on a fairly even keel. You remember during the election campaign, Prime Minister Harper had said that they might be able to balance the budget a year earlier than they had expected, so about 2013-14 rather than 14-15. Already since the election, Jim Flaherty, who has been the finance minister, said, no, I think we're going to stick with our original 4-year plan. So I think that's the kind of tone you're going to get. They're not going to rush wildly into more spending or more tax cuts. They're just going to sort of play it easy for the next 3 or 4 years and hope that things get better.
Dr. Gagné, what are the implications for Quebec?
Well, I think it's difficult to say. I don't think that the Conservatives will hold a grudge against Quebec. I mean, after all, they've got the same number of MPs than the Liberals, so they are not worse off, and more than the Bloc Québécois for that matter. So the real surprise was, of course, the election of close to 60 new Democrats MPs from Quebec, knowing that beforehand there was only one, which was the second only in Quebec's history. So that came quite as a surprise. But I don't think it's going to change much, apart from the fact that the Conservatives will have even more problems to find ministers from Quebec.
Can we say that the Quebec going in for NDP was a referendum against change, the very much needed change that Quebec really needs? For instance, in terms of the harsh labor union environment, can we say that it was because let's not forget that Mr. Charest was eventually, at some point in time, a conservative. So, and initially he did try to bring in conservative cutbacks and carbon tax, etc. So can we say that this was a rejection of a more tight economic policy, of which the Conservatives may have brought in?
Not necessarily. I think the Conservatives made some mistakes in the way they handled Quebec, particularly when they implemented cuts in the Department of Canadian Heritage. They were resented in Quebec, as well as some measures like the registration of arms. So these measures are extremely unpopular in Quebec, and it was fairly well known that the Conservatives were not going to have many MPs from Quebec. But why Quebecers turned to the NDP was really the surprise of the election. And it's not because they have turned to the left. It's really because they wanted change, and they thought that the Bloc did not symbolize this change anymore, or not more precisely, the change that the Bloc wants, which is sovereignty for Quebec. Quebecers were looking for something else, at least for the meantime, and because of the charisma of Jack Layton, whose performance in the French debate appealed to many, people turn to the NDP, but again, it's not because Quebecers have turned leftist all of a sudden. It's not because they are more sympathetic to the policies of the NDP necessarily. It seems really because first they wanted some change, and second that Jack Layton was popular and came to symbolize this change. So, of course, now the challenge for the NDP will be to deliver the goods, as we say, because a lot will be expected from the NDP.
What do you expect in terms of equalization funds? There's this whole tug of war. As far as even Alberta goes, we want more from because we are giving in more. But so has Quebec been demanding more, and now we have the eternal problem of Ontario wanting more as well because its economy is not doing well. How do you see this playing out, or do you think such kind of decisions are not likely to be taken?
There's going to be a very interesting debate over the next 2 years between Ottawa and the provinces. It will focus primarily around Ottawa's transfers on health care, but it will be a front for, I think, a bigger discussion on equalization and transfers as a whole. And the Harper government's in a unique position now because it has it is the smallest, has the smallest caucus from Quebec of any majority government in 100 years. So what Quebec desires, what Quebec wants, they won't ignore that. They're politicians. They're always hopeful they'll get more seats in some place that sort of rejected them the next time around. But they don't, I think, have to make the same case. They don't have to accept the same case from Quebec that they did. And Quebec is also, in a broader sense, declining in terms of national population. And so you already see here the Conservatives suggesting that they might add 30 more seats to the House of Commons, none of which would be in Quebec. And that would further dilute Quebec's influence. But having said that, then you have, I think, also outside of Quebec, less interest in appeasing or pleasing Quebec among the population than you did, say, in the 80s or the 90s. If there were to be another Quebec referendum next month, would there be a love-in like there was in 95 where people flew in at reduced costs from all across the country to try and show their support for Quebec in the last few days of the referendum? So we have those interesting dynamics because we're going to have this big debate over the next couple of years about federal government's contributions to healthcare funding, which will have broad implications for its overall contributions to all kinds of federal provincial funding. And for the first time that we've had one of these big debates since the late 1950s, Quebec's voice will not necessarily have to be given first listen to. The Conservatives may well do that. They may well decide that they want influence in Quebec and they want more seats in Quebec, so they're going to play up what Quebec wants. But this is the first case where Quebec is going to have to make its case for more money based on solid policy, rather than just the political argument that if you don't give us more money, you will get fewer seats here and you'll lose your majority, because they don't have that. They don't have that hammer to hold over the Conservatives' head. The Conservatives only have 7 seats there. They could pick up 7 extra seats in Ontario quite easily, probably, and replace everything that they've had in Quebec, and not have to worry so much. So it's going to be a very interesting dynamic that way, in that we are going to, I think, see a much more policy-centered debate about what's needed on equalization and transfers than we have in the past, which have been largely political debates.
But it may lead to alienation as far as Quebec goes, don't you think? And that may, in turn, whip up local, provincial political, it may whip up separatism once again. Are
it
you
undoubtedly
worried about
will,
that?
and I'm not particularly worried about that, because I've long believed that Quebecers should decide for themselves what their status should be. If they want to be part of the country or they want to be an independent, that's for them to decide. Certainly if Ottawa doesn't give in to what are seen as Quebec's demands on health care and other equalization, the PQ will use that as political fodder to win the next election, although the PQ could stay silent for the next 6 months and they would still, I think, beat the Liberals in the provincial election in Quebec. But certainly that will whip up sentiment. But there's already an awful lot of resentment towards the Conservatives in Quebec. It may be a big deal, as Dr. Gagné said, in Quebec about funding for heritage or the gun registry. But it would surprise people, I think, in the rest of Canada to find out that cutbacks on local arts funding would cause many people in one province to turn against a single party. So for arts funding cuts to cause many people in Quebec to turn against the Conservatives would seem kind of trivial for a lot of other Canadians. So you've got that disconnect as well, where, yes, maybe some of the things the Conservatives do will whip up some resentment in Quebec, but I'm not sure that there is any more the sentiment that there used to be 20 years ago for finding accommodation for that.
Dr. Gagné, I know I was speaking with you earlier, and you were as adamant about the fact that economic diversification of Quebec is what economically, what the country should be looking at. It's a question that even Alberta is talking about. Quebec is as important to Canada because a lot of, I think, 40% of the GDP, perhaps, I'm not very sure about the statistics, but around that much. It's a huge manufacturing base. So, do you think it's time for Canada to look at Quebec as really an economic giant that is in slumber still and needs some central direction? Dr. Gagné?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I understand the question very well. I know, on the other hand, that, Alberta and Quebec have a lot in common in terms of their looking outside of Canada for exports and other markets and investment opportunities. And they have both been quite present on the international scene for these purposes. And as we mentioned earlier, what is amazing is that, especially when we recall the debate over free trade in the late 80s and over NAFTA in the early 90s, we were afraid the United States would gradually ease Canada, while in fact it's not at all the case. The United States figures less and less in Canada's trade, which is amazing, despite NAFTA. And of course, China now plays a large role, but beyond China, both Quebec and Alberta are looking for economic opportunities out of North America, particularly out of the United States. And Quebec has been at the forefront as you may know, of the negotiations for a free trade agreement between the European Union and Canada. And more generally, provinces have been at the forefront because the negotiations involve provincial jurisdictions to a great extent, particularly services. And so I think Alberta and Quebec have a lot in common in terms of economic diversification.
So how do you think the government is going to, or the central government, that is the federal government, is going to look at this? On the one hand, there's this whole talk about hemispheric togetherness. I mean, the North American great hemispheric economics. And at the same time, we look at the U.S. and we see it floating around with even a country like Panama, having trade agreements with them. And yet, at the same time, they're making it more difficult for Canada to export its oil. For instance, the pipeline that would carry oil directly to the Texas refineries, that's still, gathering dust. How do you think the Conservative government is going to stir America into looking at us again?
Well, we've already seen a lot in sort of like in the background over the last 10 years since the 9/11 attack. The Americans have been much more focused on Canada as a secure source of oil and natural gas than they were before. We are now far and away their largest supplier of foreign oil and natural gas. People think in the United States about the Middle Eastern countries as their suppliers, but we've surpassed them. And with the expansion of the oil sands, I think that's only going to increase. I think eventually the Keystone Pipeline is going to be approved. Right now, the biggest single hurdle is environmentalists. And I think because President Obama and the Democrats in the United States Congress are more attuned to what environmentalists want than the Republicans are, they're reluctant to give in to the Keystone Pipeline. But eventually, as part of their security of supply, they will give in to it. There's a second aspect to the pipeline, though. Of course, not only will it take oil to the Texas refineries, which is, I think, how it will eventually be sold to the Americans. This is a good way to bring in oil from a peaceful, friendly country and have it refined in Texas, create jobs in the American Southwest. The other aspect to it is that if it's completed right to the Gulf Coast, it's very good for us because it opens up the Chinese market more even than we have now.
In fact, I was going to ask you, do you think that's going to be the moratorium off the BC coast? The tankers are not, there's a moratorium on the flying of tankers there. Do you think the Conservative government is going to lift that and make it easier for Alberta to ship its oil to the Chinese market?
I think so, but I think that there is an opportunity for them to hold off approval for a couple of years or more because we're still building pipeline capacity out to the West Coast. Once the pipelines are completed out to the West Coast, then you're going to have to lift the moratorium to bring the tankers in to get the oil. At this moment, it's an academic argument because the pipelines don't exist there yet. So the government can sort of drag its feet a little while, warm people up a little bit to the idea of lifting the moratorium, maybe have a couple of commons committees look at it and find, it's not as bad as we originally thought it was. I mean, all the political games that they can play about it because they have the luxury of 2 or 3 years before they actually have to have a decision. So they'll take their time on that. But I think, too, we Canadians, particularly people who are interested in breaking us from the hegemony of American economics, should be keen to see the pipeline to Texas go ahead because if it goes straight out to the Gulf Coast, the Chinese will be able to send tankers to pick up oil there as well as from our own West Coast, and that will make our dependence on the United States much smaller than it is because we'll have another giant consumer for our oil and gas in China.
Dr. Gagné, you were talking about environmental studies that you've done as far as the Northern Hemisphere goes, and you said you would share your experience, what the major obstacles there are.
No, I've never worked on the environment per se. What I was mentioning was that when there was under NAFTA some disputes between investors and some NAFTA parties, including the Canadian government, these investor-state cases, as we call them, led to some serious issues of public policy, what governments can and cannot do without being liable to investors' claims.
Quebec, too, has its Great North opened up now to mining. So will that create any kind of environmental issues? And where do you think it's leading, the opening up of the North?
Yeah, it's difficult to say at this moment, but it's true. I mean, this week, the Premier of Quebec announced something very dear to his heart, which is the Plan Nord, the plan for the development of the North. It's a very ambitious plan, which reminds us of the James Bay Plan in the 1970s. So it's a multi-year plan with billions of dollars that are announced over the next few decades. So, yeah, as far as mining activities are concerned, of course the environmentalists are going to complain about that. But if it leads to investment, unless the investments are displeased by some policies of the government, we don't see why there should be some investor claims that the government is breaching a specific NAFTA provision dealing with investment.
Thank you so much for joining.
Also force Quebec to change its mining laws, which are outdated, and we will see.
Do you expect them to take this up? Changing of laws as far as...
well, I don't remember the term in English, but les gaz de schiste is this new natural gas that we're supposed to have a lot of in Canada.
Shale gas.
Shale
gas, sorry, thank you. We found out that when some companies wanted to exploit shale gas in Quebec, but that led to an issue, as it has led to a similar kind of issue in many countries, that our mining laws in Quebec are sort of peculiar. That is, for instance, even though you own a piece of land, if it's found that you have, as in the example, shale gas on your property, well, it's no longer your property in the sense that you cannot prevent anyone from exploiting the resource, the underground natural resource or mineral of any kind. And that is according to Quebec's mining laws that have not been amended since the second part of the 19th century. So this has led to a discussion about reforming the mining laws.
Thank you so much for being with us.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. So do you see any impact on, do you see that this is going to change Quebec, for instance? They're going to change their laws. They're going to be more friendly towards investment. Do you see that happening?
I think so. I mean, they've already made huge changes in the last probably 10 or 15 years. They've become much more entrepreneurial. If you had said in 1995 that Quebec would become comfortable in its own skin, within its own province, and that would lead then to them being more outward-looking towards trade with other countries, I might have scoffed at that, but that's certainly what's happened, I think, as they've become less concerned by particular cultural policies and more comfortable being left alone within Canada. I mean, I think the federal government now makes less effort to reform Quebec to make it happy in Canada. It simply leaves it alone and says, well, if you're happy and you're still in Canada, that's good. You might not be engaged with the rest of the country, but you're happy being left alone. I mean, I think Albertans would go for that as well. I think they would say, if Ottawa would just leave us alone, we would be happier. And as that has happened in Quebec, as that's evolved, Quebecers have found their muscle and their voice as business people. And they are now looking, as you and Dr. Gagné both said, they're the big push now between a free trade agreement between Ottawa and the European Union. I think that'd be excellent for all of Canada. But it's something that's being driven by Quebec, and it's something that Quebecers might not have been engaged in a generation ago. So I do think you're going to see a change. I think also in Quebec, no matter what Ottawa does, the Charest government, the Liberal government, is going to lose. I mean, it's simply been so involved with corruption and incompetence that it wouldn't matter who was running against them. I don't think it's a referendum on federalism versus sovereignty. It's merely a referendum on good government, potentially good government, versus the bad government people know. And so no matter when the election happens in Quebec, the Liberals are gone. And it doesn't matter what Ottawa does. You remember perhaps during the last Quebec election that the Harper government in Ottawa sent extra transfers to Quebec so that, among other things, the Quebec government could give Quebecers a tax decrease. That probably helped them stave off loss there. They could send enough money to Quebec City now that the Quebec government could give everyone in Quebec tax freedom, and they still wouldn't win. That's how unpopular
So
they
is
are.
it the NDP that's poised to win the provincial
No,
elections?
it's the Parti Québécois.
So you do think that they will whip up something before?
Yes, but I don't know. If they're smart, they won't whip it up till after they win. If you look at what happened during the federal election, there was a big rally, a big convention for the Parti Québécois. They had their big annual convention. Gilles Duceppe from the Bloc Québécois made a speech saying, if you win the provincial election, we will take all of our clout in Ottawa and work with the PQ government in Quebec to bring about final independence and a new referendum. And as soon as he said that, the BQ's support in Quebec went down. Not, I think, because a lot of Quebec voters are suddenly federalists, but simply because they don't really want another referendum. They don't want to be bothered by independence. They want someone in Ottawa who will demand a lot of things for Quebec, which the NDP will do. But they don't want someone who, in addition to demanding things for Quebec, will also try and bring about another referendum for independence.
So economics is trumping over everything else?
I think that's true.
That brings me to my question. I know you're the naysayer as far as global warming goes.
Yes.
I know. I want to play a clip, and I want to ask you how changed in your position are you now?
Okay.
It's good timing that I'm here today to talk about global warming, because the good news for those of you from Manitoba is that today your esteemed Premier, Gary Dewar, announced a 4-year, $145 million program to make sure that Manitoba lives up to Canada's Kyoto commitments. So he's now talking about huge taxes on energy producers, which of course will be filtered down to home heating bills and other prices around the province, as he tries fatuously to reduce emissions by nearly a quarter over the next 4 years, as though that were in the power of any politician to do, and particularly a provincial politician. But the very good news for Manitobans here this evening is that Manitoba is going to be, as part of this program, the first province to authorize the Zen on Manitoba streets. The Zen is a all-electric car made in Toronto, which looks very much like a beer fridge tipped on its side. I believe it is made entirely out of aluminum foil, but I'm not sure. It is going to be approved in Manitoba, despite the fact that it has never once been crash tested. And here's the especially good news, if you get behind one. The manufacturer claims that its top speed is 40 kilometers. Imagine your favorite stretch of 2-lane highway in Manitoba as a Zen putters along at the outrageous speed of 32 kilometers an hour, whining like crazy as it hits top end, and about 20 kilometers out of town stops completely because it's run out of battery.
That was 2008. Have you changed since?
No.
No?
No, not a bit.
So some naysayers have progressed on to accepting the fact that there is global warming. It doesn't matter whether it's man-made or whether it's the cyclical movement of Mother Earth, but they have come to accept that, and they've come to accept the benefits of it. Even as we speak, I think there's some conference going on with the U.S. Secretary of State, talking about the opportunities as far as the Arctic goes. What's your take on that?
I don't think there's any denying that the Arctic is warmer than it was 70 years ago. Whether that's because someone's idling an SUV in their driveway in Toronto or not is up for discussion. But as the Arctic frees up, we do need to be in the north showing our presence, or other countries are going to come in and claim resources that are ours for their own. And you've seen that with Prime Minister Harper in the past. In the last 2 or 3 years, he's made a bigger commitment to the Arctic than any other prime minister, I think, since about Diefenbaker. John Diefenbaker was also a big proponent of Arctic development, and I think you'll see Stephen Harper keep pushing on that. Whether or not that lasts, whether or not the cold comes back in the next little while or not, will be the determining factor as to how successful that is.
Do you see the oil companies working, the U.S. and Canada, cooperating on the Arctic, or do you see a bit of a strife there?
It's very difficult to tell between the American arm of an oil company and the Canadian arm. There are some large Canadian independents now, but I don't think you're going to see Ottawa giving favoritism to the Canadian independents. There are 2 or 3 large Canadian-owned oil companies that are not subsidiaries of American companies. I think you'll see them in the Arctic, but I don't think you'll see them as under the National Energy Program as the only players up there, because Ottawa has stepped in to keep others out. I think you'll see them as among all of the players, and there'll be American companies up there as well.
Because we do see that banks and oil companies are taking risk assessment as an environmental risk factor as something to hedge against. So this is being considered. I mean, despite whatever the naysayers may say, this is being accepted.
And I think within 20 years they're going to stop doing that. But at the moment, because the political environment is in favor of the global warming theory, companies have to take environmental assessment into account in that way, simply because if they don't, the governments are not going to permit them the development grants that they want.
How do you see, my last question would be basically on the fact that the economy has slowed down. They say that it is coming up. I mean, it's moving upward, but there are certain factors that are of concern. For instance, the fact that government spending accounts for a large amount, and I have some figures here. It's amounting for a large amount of and consumer spending is also, but as far as investments go into industry, that's minus 10%. Does that worry you?
Of course, and it worries me not only that there's been a decline in investment, but also that the government has sucked in all of that money and is now deciding where it should go through the stimulus program. The government is like a bag of flour on the tail of a bird. It doesn't do it any good. So as soon as we can switch back from government consuming so much of the economy to private investors deciding where money should go, we'll see growth return. And I think you're going to see the federal Tories do that very slowly, very conservatively, in little tiny steps over the next 4 years. But that as soon as they get out of the way and their debt needs, their debt servicing costs and their deficit borrowing needs are not as large, the economy will start to grow faster.
But there's this huge thing about, total debt, household debt is 1.47 trillion as of September 2010, up 23% from 1.19 trillion in December 2007. And the interest rates, that's a dilemma, what to do with them, because there's the inflation concern as well. So how do you think this is going to work out in the long run?
If I knew that, I'd be rich. But the only thing I can guess is that we've come to the point, I think, where government has gotten about as big as Canadians are comfortable with. We're not tea partiers. We're not like Americans where we'll have protests and say, make the government smaller, it's too big. But we just get uncomfortable with it when it gets a little too large. Politicians get a sense of that. They cut back. And when they do that, the inflationary pressures decline because the government isn't competing with the private investors for money. So I think over time, very slowly and gradually, again, in small incremental steps, you'll see things kind of return to where they were in the mid-2000s.
And you're confident that jobs are going to be created and the economy is going to...
There's never, not even the Great Depression was permanent. Always there's an end to it. Now, when it'll be and how robust it will be, I can't say.
But there's a structural change going on there in terms of manufacturing jobs having gone.
Yes, but we have now almost half of people under the age of 55 have some sort of college or university education. So that's not a manufacturing workforce. That's a services workforce. That's a investment workforce. We'll get very good. We've become very good at mining heavy oil and oil sands. But that's not a low-level, uneducated task. I mean, you have to be extremely good at engineering, at financing, at trade, and all of those kinds of jobs are increasing in Canada. And I think we'll see that we've become a much more post-industrial, post-manufacturing society than we already are.
Thank you so much for being
You're
with
welcome.
us here today. And that brings us to the end of this program. Thank you for being with us.